Hi, I'm Mr. Loomis. Welcome back for this third and final lesson about World War II. Today, instead of talking about fascist dictators, generals, battles, and bullets, we're going to learn about all the ways World War II changed life in the United States. This is something we often overlook, since aside from the attack on Pearl Harbor, there was no fighting in the United States itself. But the war had an enormous and very interesting impact on life in America. Let's get started with a preview of our topics. We're going to start with how the war changed our government and where people live in our country. We'll go on to learn about an idea Roosevelt called the arsenal of democracy, which is an amazing story of American business. We're going to close today's lesson and our unit about World War II by learning how it affected some specific groups of Americans, including women, African Americans, Native Americans, Hispanics, and most of all, Japanese Americans. Let's get started today with the story of how the government got our country ready for war. Even though Americans had tried to stay out of the war, the country had gotten ready to fight before 1941. Factories had started to build more weapons because of Congress's cash and carry and Lend-Lease laws. However, when the United States entered the war, most of American factories were still making things for regular people. And many Americans were not sure if business owners would want to make things for the military. Just a few years earlier, business leaders had made Roosevelt angry when they did not fully support the New Deal. Getting business leaders to support the war was needed if the United States was going to make enough weapons to win. To get them to join in, the government promised to pay enough so that business owners would make money. Because of this, factories made 2 or 3 times the number of things they did before the war. American businesses had made $6.4 billion in 1940, but made almost $11 billion in 1944. As the country switched to war production, the top 100 American companies received approximately 70% of government contracts. The war made big businesses rich. The country needed an army. For the first time in American history, the draft had started before the country joined the war. But the first men called to join the army had to serve for only 1 year. After the attack on Pearl Harbor, a large draft program was started to get men into the Navy and the Army. Over the course of the war, approximately 50 million men registered for the draft, and 10 million served in uniform. While millions of Americans joined the fight, there were some who did not. About 72,000 men registered as conscientious objectors, and 52,000 were approved. Of those 52,000, some took non-combat jobs in the military, and others took unpaid jobs in work camps. Many were part of religious groups who did not believe in war, such as the Quakers or Mennonites. They were willing to serve their country, but they did not want to kill. Many Americans did not like conscientious objectors. Family members often turned against them. Only a very small number of men tried to get out of the draft. President Roosevelt and his team already had experience in writing rules for businesses because of the New Deal. During the war, major labor unions promised not to strike so that factories making things for the war would not shut down. In return, the government got businesses to work with the unions and promised to help workers bargain for better pay. In April 1941, Roosevelt created the Office of Price Administration, OPA. The OPA had the power to set prices for all things except farm products, and to ration a long list of items. This was to make sure that soldiers had enough food and the military had enough supplies. Civilians were given ration books of coupons that let them buy limited amounts of meat, coffee, butter, sugar, and other foods. Wartime cookbooks were written, telling housewives how to prepare tasty meals without some food items. Other items were rationed as well, including shoes, alcohol, cigarettes, and gasoline. Americans were allowed to drive their cars only on certain days of the week. Most Americans thought that following these rules was an important part of helping their country win. Civilians on the home front also recycled, saved, and participated in scrap drives to collect items needed for the war. Housewives saved cooking fats needed to make bombs. Children collected scrap metal, paper, rubber, silk, nylon, and old rags. Some children gave up their favorite metal toys. Civilian volunteers, trained to recognize enemy aircraft, watched the skies along the beaches and on the borders. As in previous wars, the government turned to bond drives to pay for the war. Millions of Americans purchased more than $185 billion worth of war bonds. Children bought victory stamps and turned in full stamp books for bonds. Schools held fundraising drives to buy war bonds, sometimes setting a target that would match to the cost of an airplane, which would then be adopted by the school. The federal government also started the current system of taking taxes out of every paycheck to make sure taxes were paid on time. Once again, the government tried to get Americans to plant victory gardens so that food grown on farms could be used for the military. Americans planted gardens in their backyards and empty lots. Many schools planted gardens as well. All of these efforts, from rationing to victory gardens to changing people's opinions, were done with government propaganda made by the Office of War Information. In every war, the government grows in size as it tries to get the country to work to win the war. World War II was no different, and the government was much bigger at the end. One important effect of the war was the way it changed how young men and women thought about their government. This greatest generation had to make big sacrifices to win, and forever after the war, they held a positive view of government. After all, Roosevelt's New Deal helped save them as teenagers in the 1930s, and the huge power of their government led them and America to victory in the 1940s. For this generation of Americans, government is good. Now let's take a look at the way the war led to important changes in where people lived. California became a training ground because soldiers could train there for tank warfare and beach landings, as well as desert attacks. California was also a good place to build factories. As thousands of Americans moved to the West Coast to take jobs in defense factories and shipyards, cities grew quickly. For example, Richmond grew from a city of 20,000 people to 100,000 in just 3 years. Almost overnight, the population of California shot up. African Americans moved out of the South into northern or West Coast cities to work in factories. Women also moved to follow their husbands to military bases or to take jobs in the factories. We've talked a lot so far about the government and its role in getting the country ready for war. But someone had to run the factories that built all those tanks, ships, and planes. And it was the business leaders of America that stepped up to do the job. Let's take a look at their story. By the time the war ended in 1945, the United States had produced 40% of all the things used in the war. This huge production gave the United States the nickname the Arsenal of Democracy. In fact, the name came from one of President Roosevelt's fireside chats. After America joined the War Production Board and the country's factories made a huge change. Factories that made silk ribbons started making parachutes. Car factories made tanks. Typewriter companies made machine guns. Undergarment makers sewed mosquito netting, and so on. The WPB made sure that each factory received the materials it needed to run so that they could make the most war goods in the shortest time. 1/4 of what was spent was for airplanes, and 1/4 was for ships. Some companies made more of what they were already making. Goodyear made more tires, US Steel made more steel, and Boeing turned out more airplanes. Other companies changed their factories to make war material. Ford and Chrysler, for example, stopped building cars and started building airplanes and tanks. Hollywood is an important industry also. During the Great Depression, movies had been a welcome distraction from everyday life. And during the war, this was also true. By 1941, there were more movie theaters than banks in the United States. In a world before television or streaming video, newsreels were shown in movie theaters before movies so that people could learn about what was happening in the world. Movies with information about the war were also shown in movie theaters. The most famous were those in the Why We Fight series, filmed by Hollywood director Frank Capra. Many movies were patriotic stories that showed movie stars as soldiers fighting the Germans and Japanese. Besides being in patriotic movies, many male movie stars gave up their careers to serve in the military. Female entertainers did their part as well. Rita Hayworth and Marlene Dietrich traveled and sang for soldiers. African-American singer and dancer Josephine Baker performed for Allied troops in North Africa and carried secret messages for the French resistance. Some famous singers even died supporting the war. Actress Carole Lombard and Glenn Miller both died in plane crashes during the war as they traveled to perform for soldiers. We've learned about some of the important leaders during World War II: Roosevelt, Churchill, Stalin, Hitler. But we're going to finish by talking about people who are not usually remembered individually, but rather for what they did and how the war affected them as a group. Let's start with the story of American women. As in the previous war, men joined the military. This meant more chances for women to get jobs. For example, by 1943, more women than men were working to build airplanes. In the end, women worked in both factories and offices. White women who'd been working before the war were paid more. African American women who'd only been able to work as servants took over white women's lower paying jobs in factories. Although women were earning more money than ever before, it was still far less than men received for doing the same work. Still, many were able to earn their own money for the first time. By 1944, as many as 33% of the women working in factories were mothers and worked, another big change for America. Not everyone was happy about women working in jobs that had normally only been for men. In order to get women for factory jobs, the government created a propaganda campaign using a character known as Rosie the Riveter. Rosie was tough, yet feminine. To make men feel like working in factories would not make women too much like men, some factories gave female workers lessons in how to put on makeup, and makeup was never rationed during the war. Although many Americans saw women working as a good thing, they also knew that having jobs made being a mother more difficult. To try to help working mothers, Eleanor Roosevelt tried to get her husband to approve the first government child care centers. The First Lady also tried to get business leaders to build child care facilities for their workers. Still, these efforts did not meet the full demand for child care for working mothers during the war. Because there was not enough child care facilities, many children had to look out for themselves after school. And some had to do housework, and older children had to watch their younger brothers and sisters. Some mothers took young children to work with them, sometimes, and left them locked in their cars during the day. Police reported more crimes committed by children during the war. It's not clear if more children were really committing crimes, or if police were just being more careful to notice problems during the war. Either way, working women were often blamed for this problem. Many women went beyond working in factories. About 350,000 joined the military. They worked as nurses, drove trucks, fixed airplanes, and did office work to free up men for fighting. Those who joined the Women's Air Force Service Pilots, or WASPs, flew planes from the factories to military bases. Some of these women were killed or captured as prisoners of war. Women also joined the United States Naval Reserve, better known as the WAVES, for women accepted for voluntary emergency service, where they took the place of men in jobs away from the fighting. Over 1,600 of the women nurses received awards for courage under fire, and many thousands more served behind the lines of battle. Women also went to work in a variety of government jobs. Others worked as chemists and engineers, making weapons for the war. These included thousands of women who worked on the Manhattan Project, creating the atomic bomb. In the end, the war had a big change on what women did in American life. Not so much for the women who held jobs in the war, but more so for their daughters. Because after the war ended, the men came home, most of the Rosies, Waves, and nurses and other women who had left home to work went back home to raise children. But they told their daughters stories of their wartime jobs, their feeling of independence, and by their example, they showed that women did not have to live in a world limited by the old cult of domesticity, the walls of the home. These girls of the 1950s and 60s would grow up to break down many gender walls. Next, let's learn about how the war affected African Americans. African Americans had a good relationship with President Roosevelt and his team at the start of the war because of work by civil rights leaders like Mary McLeod Bethune and Roosevelt's Black Cabinet. Eleanor Roosevelt helped make sure that Bethune was given a job on the Advisory Council set up by the War Department Women's Interest Section. In this position, Bethune was able to start the first officer school for women and let African American women become officers in the Women's Auxiliary Corps. As the economy got going again because of factories making things for the war, African Americans wanted to make sure that their service to the country earned them better jobs and more equal treatment. African American labor leader A. Philip Randolph was important in this area. The leader of the Railroad Car Porters Union, Randolph got President Roosevelt to sign Executive Order 8802, which started the Fair Employment Practices Committee. The job of this committee was to make sure that there was no discrimination in defense jobs. They forced companies that sold things to the military to give jobs to African American workers. During the war, the Congress of Racial Equality, or CORE, founded by James Farmer in 1942, used peaceful protests like sit-ins to desegregate public places in Washington, D.C. as its way of supporting the war. Members of CORE tried to get other Americans to support their work by showing that Germany was using racism in America as its propaganda. After all, they said, if the United States was going to criticize Germany and Japan for not following human rights, the country should itself be a model. CORE's actions were in keeping with the goals of the Double V campaign. The campaign called on African Americans to win the 2 V's, victory over America's foreign enemies and victory over racism in the United States. Approximately 1 million African Americans served in the military. At first, African American soldiers served in separate units that had been used as support troops and not sent into the fighting. By the end of the war, however, the Army needed men, and African Americans served in the front lines and flew planes. The Tuskegee Institute in Alabama trained African American pilots. First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt visited Tuskegee in 1941, took a ride on a plane flown by an African American pilot to convince the military to let African American pilots join the Air Force. When the Tuskegee Airmen did get their opportunity to fight, they showed that they were excellent pilots. Even though African Americans were ready to fight for the United States, racial tensions often led to violence. As many African Americans moved to find new jobs to support the war, they often moved closer to whites. There were race riots in Detroit, Harlem, and Beaumont, Texas, in which whites attacked their new black neighbors. There were also racial fights at or near some military bases in the South. African American leaders such as James Farmer and Walter White, the leader of the NAACP, were asked by General Eisenhower to investigate complaints that whites were mistreating African American men in the military. The work of leaders like Bethune, Randolph, Farmer, and White helped start the civil rights movement that happened after the war and had better-known leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X. Although they made up only a tiny part of America's army, Native Americans made a special contribution to the war. In all, 44,000 Native Americans served in uniform. While American cryptographers had broken both German and Japanese codes, American messages were always secret. Navajo soldiers sent messages over radios using codes based on their native language, which no one in Japan knew. They became known as code talkers and were a part of the battles of Guadalcanal, Iwo Jima, Peleliu, and Tarawa. A smaller group of Comanche code talkers performed a similar job in Europe. By making use of the native language rather than making a code based on English, which was well known in both Germany and Japan, Native Americans showed that sometimes great contributions can come from unexpected places. Mexican Americans also had a hard time because of racial prejudice during the war years. The number of Mexican Americans in Southern California grew during World War II because Mexican farm workers moved to the United States to take the jobs left by whites who had joined the military. The United States and Mexican governments started the Bracero program in 1942, which helped Mexican farm workers find jobs in America. The result was the immigration of thousands of poor Mexicans into the United States to work as braceros. Forced to live in the segregated barrios of East Los Angeles, many young Mexican Americans wanted to create their own identity and began to dress in a style called the zoot suit, which were also popular among young African Americans and Filipino men. The zoot suits, which used a lot of cloth to make, broke wartime rules about rationing. Some said that these young Mexican Americans were unpatriotic. Some white Americans also said Mexican American men were not willing to serve in the military, even though about 350,000 Mexican Americans served. In the summer of 1943, the Zoot Suit riots broke out in Los Angeles when white sailors on leave in the city, some white people living there, beat up a group of young men wearing zoot suits. In return, young Mexican American men attacked and beat up sailors. Things got out of hand fast as sailors and white Americans went out attacking young Mexican Americans in the street, in bars and movie theaters. More than 100 people were injured. The local newspapers wrote about the racist attacks, saying they had cleaned Los Angeles of miscreants and hoodlums. The Los Angeles City Council even tried to make it illegal to wear a zoot suit. The military finally stopped the rioting by stopping sailors from going into the city of Los Angeles. But maybe it's no surprise that their official position was that their men were acting in self-defense. Japanese Americans suffered the worst discrimination of any group of Americans during the war. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor led to a flood of racist ideas about Japanese immigrants and Japanese Americans in the United States. The result was Executive Order 9066, signed by President Roosevelt on February 19, 1942. This order gave the Army power to move people from military areas to prevent sabotage or espionage. The exclusion zone included most of Washington, Oregon, and all of California, as well as parts of Arizona. Everyone of Japanese ancestry in that area, both citizens and not-citizens, was forced to move to internment camps far from their homes. In the end, about 120,000 people of Japanese ancestry had to move. 66% of them were American citizens born in the United States. Internment camps were built in the interior of California, Arizona, Colorado, Utah, Idaho, Wyoming, and Arkansas. For the Japanese Americans who were sent to the camps, the experience was traumatic. Families were sometimes separated. People could only bring a few of their things and had to leave most of what they owned behind. Many lost their homes, businesses, and farms as they sold them in a rush. The camps themselves were bad and overcrowded. Still, the people there tried to build communities and restart normal life. Adults participated in camp government, worked at a variety of jobs. Children went to school, played sports against local teams, and joined Boy Scout units. But still, they got in trouble for small things like going too close to the camp gate or barbed wire fences. Most Japanese Americans chose to accept their imprisonment as a way to show that they were loyal to the United States. But a few resisted. Frank Korematsu was a Japanese American who decided to stay in San Leandro, California, to break the exclusion order on purpose. He went to court, saying that Executive Order 9066 was unconstitutional because it violated his Fifth Amendment right to due process. In other words, Korematsu said, if the government wanted to put him in a prison, it would have to put him on trial for a crime first. Clearly, the only thing he'd done wrong was being born into a Japanese family, which was not a crime. His case, Korematsu v. United States, was decided by the Supreme Court in 1944, and he lost, even though no interned Japanese Americans were ever found guilty of sabotage or espionage. The system of internment camps lasted until the end of the war. Today, historians put the Korematsu court case into the same category as the Dred Scott and Plessy v. Ferguson cases, pointing out that sometimes the Supreme Court makes terrible mistakes because of prejudice. Despite being singled out for special treatment, many Japanese Americans wanted to join the army, but often could not because white leaders in the army did not trust them. However, as the war went on, army leaders changed their mind. In total, nearly 33,000 Japanese Americans served in the army during the war. One group, the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, nicknamed the Go for Broke, won more awards than any other unit in American military history. In 1988, Japanese-American leaders were able to get Congress to pass the Civil Liberties Act, which gave $20,000 in reparations to each surviving person who'd been locked up in the internment camps. For many, the money was an important way for the government to apologize. In all, more than 81,000 people qualified for the payments. That concludes our study of World War II. Let's finish by recapping our big ideas. During the war, the government grew. Government offices produced propaganda to encourage people for rationing, scrap jobs, war bond sales, and participation in efforts such as victory gardens. Population shifted, especially to California, which became a center for war production and troop developments. American industry transformed itself and produced supplies for the war in record numbers. Government officials and industrial tycoons collaborated and led the celebrated arsenal of democracy. When men left to fight, women stepped up to fill in. For many American women, it was the first time they took jobs outside the home or earned a paycheck. Some women joined the fight as delivery pilots, nurses, or support personnel in government offices. Although most went back to being housewives after the war, it was an important psychological step towards gender equality. Although African Americans still were relegated to segregated units, they served in an effort to both defeat discrimination and the Axis. Philip Randolph convinced President Roosevelt to order an end to discrimination in industries that contracted with the government, and groups like the Tuskegee Airmen won praise for their skill and bravery. Native Americans served as code talkers, using their native language as an unbreakable code. Mexican Americans were welcomed into the country to work in fields left empty by Americans who joined the army. Even though many Hispanics joined the military, the Zoot Suit riots in Los Angeles showed that Hispanics still face prejudice from white Americans. The minority group who suffered the most were Japanese Americans. Roosevelt signed an executive order that led to the internment of the entire Japanese American population of the West Coast. The Supreme Court upheld this clear violation of civil rights. In the face of such mistreatment, young Japanese American men formed the 442nd and fought with incredible bravery in Italy against the Nazis. Eventually, in 1988, the government apologized for the internment and paid reparations to those who had suffered. Thank you very much. Make sure to study hard, use the review guide and the Quizlet sets so you'll be ready for your test. In our next unit, we'll be learning about the Cold War, which is not really a war at all until it was. It's a bit confusing. But don't worry, I'll be here to explain it to you.
Seems you're right back